In the spring of 1945 on the Pacific battlefield, the air seemed always to carry a kind of damp greyness. Artillery fire and sea wind tangled together, suspending soil, salt grains, the smell of decay, and the dust of burned matter in the air, making every breath feel as if it were pressing against a heavy taste of rust. The Battle of Okinawa had entered its final stage, and the American advance carried an irreversible momentum, pushing from the trenches in the south all the way north, constantly squeezing those island strongholds that were still holding out. In those days, Japanese field hospitals had almost become broken open caves, damp trenches, or school playgrounds blasted apart. Nakamura Aya, 21 years old, was pushed by this chaos into a corner far darker than the path her life had originally seemed to follow. She had been enrolled in an army nurse training unit at 17, and from that day on she had never truly slept on anything soft again. In the training camp, the bedding was thin canvas and bundles of straw. At the front it became bare floors, pits in the earth, hastily laid planks, or simply a wall corner to lean against. A pillow had turned into a kind of luxury that almost did not exist in reality. She had no right to demand comfort, and she could not bring herself to trust the existence of such a thing as comfort. Under long-term tension, she gradually lost the memory of how softness felt on her body and even began to mix that softness together with danger. In a collapsed cave in southern Okinawa, artillery fire tore apart the improvised surgical area where she had been working. Wounded men were thrown by the blast, instruments scattered into the waterlogged soil, and burning scraps of cloth clung to the walls. Aya curled up in a corner on instinct, and when the dust began to fall out of the air, she realized that her only way to survive was to raise her hands, just like those comrades who no longer struggled. She had never been taught how one should surrender, nor did she know what surrender would mean afterwards. She only knew that the propaganda repeated over and over during training had almost equated prisoner with humiliation. She also knew that, as a female nurse, she had been implicitly warned to be mentally prepared for the worst. For that very reason, when an American search party called for her to come out under the glare of their lights, her legs almost could not muster any strength. She was taken to a temporary collection point near the coast, a transit camp set up by the Americans to handle the increasing number of prisoners gathered each day. The camp had numbered sections, registration tents, makeshift washing and disinfection facilities, and wooden bedboards equipped strictly according to the standards of the Pacific Theatre. Compared to those places on the front that had been gnawed by artillery until only scorched earth remained, this place appeared almost too level, too orderly, to the point of being unsettling. After registration, she was assigned to a hut. Inside, 2 rows of wooden beds were lined up, so neat they looked like illustrations in a training manual. What truly froze her in place was the object an American logistics soldier put down on her bed. A pillow so soft it looked as if a fingertip could sink into it. The soldier did not notice her reaction at all. He simply spread out the cotton pad, then placed the neatly folded pillow at the foot of the bed, as if completing the most ordinary of daily tasks. But to Aya, it was like an unknown creature suddenly set down in front of her, making her retreat involuntarily until her shoulders pressed against the wooden wall and her breathing turned chaotic. She stared at that object until her eyes ached, and what surfaced in her mind were the warnings instilled during training. The enemy might use disguised objects to deceive prisoners, might hide instruments of humiliation inside things that appeared safe, might conceal danger beneath a soft exterior. The logistics soldier left, but Aya still did not dare approach the bed. Night gradually fell, and from outside the hut came the footsteps of other prisoners, the sound of low conversations, the clink of metal, and the crackling of campfires. She looked at the orderly wooden beds, at the bedding, at that pillow, as if it were something that had never belonged to her world. She stood by the wooden wall for a long time, until her legs began to tremble, and only then did she slowly edge back toward her own bed, moving as cautiously as if she were approaching an explosive. She did not touch the pillow, but pressed her body against the outer edge of the bedboard, doing her best to keep her distance from it. Her cheek rested on her own arm, just as it had on countless previous nights. In the hardness of the plank beneath her back, she found a strange kind of safety. This was the familiar pain, the world she understood, She told herself not to fall asleep, at least not before she had confirmed that nothing was hidden inside that pillow. But exhaustion washed over her like a tide and, in the end, engulfed her. For the first time in many years, she slept through an entire night. When she woke, the sky was just lightening, and from outside the hut came the sound of roll call. Aya's first reaction was not to stretch, but to quickly check her own body. She had not been tied up, had not been moved, and nothing she feared had happened. She did not even realize that, in her sleep, a small part of her weight had come to rest against the edge of the pillow. An extremely light, almost imperceptible touch, yet enough to make her heart lurch when she woke. She sat up and found that the corners of her eyes were wet. Softness had made her cry. She could not understand this reaction, yet she could not stop it either. She did not know how to explain that tear, and could only wipe it away in silence. In the days that followed, she would use her fingers to press along the edges of the pillow, trying to feel whether any metal or hard objects were hidden inside. Each time she found nothing unusual, yet her hand still trembled from tension. She tried many times to flip the pillow over, but always drew her hand back at the moment of contact. She watched other prisoners in the hut resting their heads on their pillows without the slightest wariness, and even hugging them to their chests during afternoon rest, but she could not imitate such behavior, because in her world, softness did not mean rest. It meant weakness and danger. As she struggled to adapt to the camp's regulations, the American medical examination procedures once again filled her with a kind of inexplicable tension. The smell of disinfectant in the medical tent was completely different from the stench of decay in the field hospitals, and the examinations were standardized and swift, with record forms printed in the official American format. The army doctor merely carried out palpations, note-taking, and temperature checks according to procedure, showing her no hostility, and not even using any look that might be interpreted as contempt. The only thing that left a deep impression on her was that, as he left, he unconsciously walked over to her bed and straightened the pillow she had knocked askew in her nervousness the night before. The action was utterly unremarkable, yet it was like a crack appearing in a wall, making her realize for the first time that if the Americans truly meant to humiliate her, they would hardly need a pillow to achieve it. In the days that followed, Aya gradually learned to observe the rhythm of the camp. Every morning, orders to assemble would ring out, and logistics personnel would push wooden crates through the hut area, distributing food and water. The first time she saw white bread and real hot soup, what arose in her heart was not expectation but suspicion. She did not know whether these things were truly safe to ingest, nor why the enemy would let prisoners eat better than many Japanese soldiers at the front. Her hands had been swollen for a long time due to malnutrition, and her wrists ached when she held a spoon, yet she still forced herself to swallow the food because she understood that refusing to eat would only make her body collapse faster. The camp's hygiene regulations at first made her think she was undergoing some kind of cleansing before interrogation, being required to bathe, to change into clean clothing, to hang sheets and cotton pads out to dry. These procedures were completely different from the treatment she had imagined the enemy would mete out. The Americans were not treating them as objects to humiliate, but handling them through an extremely systematized process. She had even seen logistics soldiers squatting on the ground to repair wooden beams in the huts, with canteens and lunch bags casually placed at their sides, looking no different from ordinary laborers. Scenes like this created an even more unsettling emptiness in her heart. If the enemy was not as she had been taught to imagine, then where had the fear she had clung to for so many years actually come from? Yet her sleep problems were still not truly resolved. Every night, as the temperature dropped with the sea wind and the canvas walls of the hut fluttered in the darkness, emitting a low rustling sound, she lay on her bed and always felt that the pillow was a lurking thing. She did not dare rest her head on it, and could only continue using her arm as support. She knew very well that her neck had become stiff after years of sleeping this way, but she would rather endure the pain than entrust her head to that unfamiliar softness. She could not explain this stubbornness, just as she could not explain why her whole body suddenly tensed whenever she heard American soldiers' footsteps outside. She did not know that such reactions were extremely common among people who had lived under prolonged wartime stress. She also did not know that her body was caught in a state where long-term vigilance and extreme exhaustion were intertwined. The only thing she did know was that she was afraid of relaxing, because relaxation on the battlefield meant death. One morning, after a routine roll call, Aya was outside the hut hanging bedding to dry when she unintentionally overheard a conversation between several American logistics personnel. They were not talking about prisoners, nor about hostility, but only about how strong the wind had been the previous night, how it had torn open a few seams in the canvas around the huts, and how to fasten them with new ropes. The conversation could not have been more ordinary, yet it made Aya suddenly realize that the Americans did not seem to regard them as burdens, nor as tools for political propaganda. They were simply carrying out a series of tasks laid down by regulations. They were not trying to deceive her, nor were they preparing to humiliate her. In the instant she understood this, she felt a kind of almost dizzying emptiness. Her fear had nowhere to go in the absence of an enemy, and her vigilance grew heavy in an environment without immediate threats. She was like an animal that had lived in shadow for a long time, suddenly brought into the sunlight and not knowing how not to squint. Her first true loosening came one evening at lamplighting time. That day the sea wind was strong, and the lights inside the hut shook with each gust. She sat on the edge of her bed, patting the cotton pad flat, but still did not touch the pillow. Suddenly, a prisoner walking past her accidentally kicked his own pillow, sending it tumbling to the floor like a piece of soft cloth. The prisoner bent down, picked it up, patted off the dust, shoved it back onto the bed without a second thought, and then simply lay down on it to sleep. Aya stared in a daze. So a pillow falling to the ground would not trigger any hidden mechanism, nor would it make anyone angry. It was just a soft object, something that could be straightened when it tilted, picked up when it fell, and dusted off when it became dirty. An ordinary item. That very night she reached out and touched her own pillow for the first time. The sensation was as light as wind, as soft as something that could sink into the skin. In that instant, she almost pulled her hand back, yet it was as if some long-lost memory had taken hold of her, and she unconsciously pressed along the edge of the pillow. Long ago, in her home in Tokyo, she had slept on something similar, before she joined the training unit, when she could still hear her mother patting the bedding. But that memory had been covered for so long by the noise of war that, as soon as this softness reached her fingertips, her throat felt as though it had been blocked. She rested her head on the pillow, but after only a few seconds, she lifted it again. Her heart was racing, as if she were approaching something forbidden. The second time, however, she stayed there a little longer. The tightness in her neck slowly eased, like a lock that had not been touched for many years being cautiously turned open. She remained on that softness for a full half-minute, until for the first time, the breath in her chest settled into a steady rhythm. Over the nights that followed, she no longer curled up in her sleep, but let her upper body rest gently on the cotton pad. As she turned over in her dreams, the pillow naturally came to rest under her head. It was no longer a symbol of the enemy, a trap or a tool of humiliation, but something unfamiliar yet long missed, something that allowed her body to stop being tense. When she woke before sunrise for the first time, she did not sit up in fright, but felt a faint ache that comes only when a body has truly rested. What she felt upon waking was a complex kind of shock. She had not been harmed, nor singled out. The pillow had done nothing to her. It had only let her sleep. She suddenly realized that what truly terrified her was not the pillow itself, but those years shaped by war in which she had not dared to touch anything soft. In the days that followed, she began to join the other prisoners in the daily cleaning, drying, and distribution tasks. She learned how to use the bedding properly and how to straighten her own pillow. When washing, she dried herself with a towel rather than brushing the water away with the back of her hand. She noticed that at the time of strongest afternoon sunlight, the bedding would be carried to the ropes strung through the center of the camp to dry, and that when the wind passed through, rows of pillows would sway gently like white flags. These images formed a kind of indescribable calm in her heart, The Americans did not stop her from helping to pass water in the medical tent, nor did they stop her from spending her free time looking after those prisoners who were weaker. Her hands, stiff from years of tension, felt different now when she straightened someone else's bedding. For the first time, her movements no longer felt like the mechanical operations of wartime, but like a kind of more human, instinctive care. As the days moved forward, camp life gradually settled into a stable rhythm. Each day, American logistics convoys drove in on schedule, unloading supplies, cleaning implements and medical materials, then taking away whatever needed transporting. The ground around the huts was regularly sprinkled with water by orderlies to keep down dust. The screws of the bedboards were checked every week, and food was distributed according to standard rations. This highly systematized way of running things made Aya gradually realize that everything here was built on procedure and order, not on the cruelty or humiliation that had been instilled in her since childhood. Around her own bed, she began to make very small but consistent adjustments, patting the cotton pad flat, setting the pillow straight, and even, when afternoon sunlight slanted into the hut, turning the pillow slightly so it could air out. She no longer feared touching it. That piece of softness was no longer a threat, and with each contact it made her think of something. Not of war, but of scattered sensations from life before the war. She could no longer remember when she had grown unaccustomed to softness, nor when she had first begun to believe that softness meant danger. When her fingers pressed against the pillowcase, she could feel the cotton within compressing lightly, a quiet and tangible weight, gentle in a way that did not seem to belong on a battlefield. The work in the camp's medical hut also gradually brought her back to a state that felt more like her past self. Dressing graft wounds, giving fluids to dehydrated patients, caring for ulcerated feet. She had already done these things countless times in the field hospitals, but here there was no smell of rot in the air. The instruments could be disinfected on schedule, and the water did not turn murky because the supply had been cut. The American Army doctor's demeanor was calm and free of emotional fluctuation. They behaved as they would with any patient, neither looking down on her because she was a prisoner, nor treating her with special caution because she was an enemy nurse. Within this stable work rhythm, the tension in Aya's heart began to be quietly smoothed away. Once, as she helped a prisoner burning with fever, sit up and fluffed his pillow so he could lean more comfortably, she suddenly realized that her movements were almost identical to those her mother had used many years earlier when caring for her at home when she was ill. That memory, like a shadow sealed beneath dust, was gently lifted open a crack. In that moment, her heartbeat seemed to slow by a few degrees, as if a current of warmth were flowing through her chest. She showed no outward emotion. After settling the prisoner, she quietly patted her own pillow as well. She began to realize that her body was learning how to trust quiet again, how to trust routine, how to trust those small actions that carried no hostility. Even though she still occasionally woke in the night, and still sometimes tensed suddenly at the sound of footsteps outside, these reactions no longer controlled her as they once had. She would take a deep breath and lay her cheek back on the pillow, letting the softness pull her back from the edge of fear. For a time, the camp began preparing to transfer some of the prisoners. Several trucks stood outside the huts, and officers went down the list in the registers, checking names one by one. Aya did not know when she would be placed on a convoy, but she was no longer as afraid of leaving as she had been at first. She discovered, to her own surprise, that she felt a certain attachment to these days in which her body had relearned what softness was. She did not know what conditions the next camp would offer, nor whether she would again experience hunger or cold in the future, but she understood that she had already made a very small yet fundamental change. She no longer relied on hard ground to prove her vigilance, and no longer relied on pain to reassure herself that she was alive. She even began, in the afternoons, to help other female prisoners straighten their bedding. In the field hospitals, her hands had often been trembling, hurried, and stained with blood. Here, for the first time, she felt that making a bed smooth, tidy, and warm was something meaningful. She smoothed out the cotton pads, nudged the pillows into a more comfortable angle, and folded the quilts into neat triangles. She carried out these actions with great concentration, as if she were repairing a capacity she had lost for a long time, the ability to set life upright. That afternoon, the sunlight was strong, shining on the lines of rope outside the huts where bedding was hung to dry, and rows of pillows swayed gently in the wind. Aya looked up at them, and a kind of indescribable calm surged in her chest. The pillows looked like white sails in the distance, and also like a kind of voiceless symbol. They were light, soft, unthreatening, yet unquestionably real. They were fragments of a world outside of war, sort of things she had not allowed herself to touch for so many years. She suddenly understood that her fear of war had never been only a fear of the enemy, but a fear of losing softness, of losing tranquility, of losing any sense of safety. War had taught her to protect herself with hardness, and to mistake hardness for the only reliable thing. But now, a small pillow was quietly telling her that softness was the true shape of life. It was also on that evening that she finally let go of the last remnants of her guard. She lay on her bed and gently pressed her head into the center of the pillow, no longer hesitating, no longer pulling away. The moment she closed her eyes, the pillow sagged slightly, supporting her neck and lifting her whole body as if someone in the darkness were catching her. The feeling was warm, slow, and deep, like a ray of light spreading outward from within her body. For the first time, she did not use her arm as a barrier, but completely entrusted herself to softness. That night, she slept very deeply, so deeply that even the footsteps outside could not wake her. When she woke, her eyes were damp, but this time she did not hurry to wipe them. She sat on her bed and looked at the shape of her pillow. The slight hollow left by the weight of her head was softness answering her, a gentle acceptance that needed no words for her to understand. This was not the mark of surrender, nor the mark of humiliation, but the mark of her finally allowing herself to believe in what peace might be like. In the weeks that followed, her physical condition gradually improved. The rations in the camp meant that her strength was no longer kept year-round at the brink of collapse. She began to be able to straighten her back while working, and no longer swayed on her feet from anemia. The color of her skin shifted from grayish-white to a faint, warm tone, and the blood under her nails returned. The most obvious change was in her eyes. Instead of darting around as they had when she was first captured, she could now look directly at what was in front of her, even if it was only a pillow neatly set in place. She even began to pat other prisoners' pillows of her own accord, helping them to lie more comfortably. She was not imitating anyone. The action came from instinct. She knew exactly what she was doing and why she was doing it. Because the pillow had once allowed her to loosen her grip on the tightness of war for the first time, and now she hoped she could let others feel that touch of peace as well. One morning she was informed that she would be transferred to a repatriation center for prisoners of war in the home islands. She did not resist, nor did she panic. She simply packed her bedding quietly. For the last time she straightened her pillow, her movements gentle and unhurried, as if saying farewell to something important. She did not take the pillow with her, because she knew it belonged to the camp, but she laid her hand lightly on it and let it rest there for a few seconds, as if she were touching a piece of the life she had learned to believe in again. When she walked out of the hut, sunlight was spread across the ground, and there was no smell of gunpowder in the air, no cries, only the sound of wind passing over the drying lines. In that moment, she understood a simple truth that had long been hidden by war. The beginning of peace is not when the guns fall silent, but when a person can, for the first time, sleep without fear on something soft. Many years later, back in Japan, she once again became a nurse. In the hospital, she often patted patients' pillows for them before they fell asleep, setting them into a more comfortable position. The patients never gave that action much thought, but she knew in her heart that it was something she had brought back from the prisoner of war camp. a capacity that had been stolen by war and then returned by a small pillow. She knew she would never forget that day. She had thought that soft thing was a trap, but it had in fact been the gentlest shape of peace.